What a pleasure to speak to you remotely. I'm just going to fire up my slides briefly. They look quite dramatic to start with. I hope that's all working fine. Well, good. Well, yes. So I'm really delighted to speak to you today, and I understand it's sort of quite a range of students with perhaps different backgrounds and with a medical focus. So I will do the talk in sort of two parts. The first part is one of the big projects that Isabella just described, which is this AI avatar system, and within that we embed an LLM that has evolved into the green LLM sustainable going small with large language models approach. And I'm going to do that as the second part. So kind of give you a little insight to our classroom. As I do with many of my lectures, I think you've done a great introduction for myself, so I won't dwell on who I am or what I've done. Whenever I meet students, I do like to ask, has anyone read any of my books? I don't know if any of you used these books to get into medical school. I often take the opportunity to say thank you for the money if you have, but that's sort of a little joke. But in case you've applied to UK medical schools, typically people would have read these things. And just one of the other one or two things about myself that I've done. I don't know if you all play escape room games over in Australia or wherever you are, but sort of I do a bit of escape room educational escape room design. So for our students, sometimes we put them through an escape room, but all the puzzles are rather academic. So we have sort of pharmacology related escape rooms that they do assessments on. And just to give you an idea what our classroom sometimes looks like. So this is our classroom at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Before we do the last thing, I've got two last slides, shameless self-promotion as I always do. Number one, if you're looking for the world's worst YouTube channel on anatomy learning, that's before I had the beard, quite some time ago now, I think. It's really bad. Don't subscribe to that. It's terrible, really, but it's just me reading anatomy at the screen. The reason I mention this in all AI talks is that I've been working on AI models for quite some time, and we were trying to generate enough data to create a talking head model of me before all of the deepfake, DeepSeek, and all the other voice cloning technologies. So we've got a lot of raw data of my voice when back in the days when we needed more sampling. And the last thing, which is quite fun, I think, sort of a joke that I have an Instagram profile. The joke is that I'm a real life KOL, that's key opinion lecturer. And so I do, if you're looking for the sort of shortest and ugliest model for G2000 in Hong Kong, then that's me. Okay, so you might see me from time to time. Anyway, enough about myself. Let's talk about what you're here for. So AI in our classrooms. I think it's very interesting. Even 2 years ago, if you read through the medical education literature, there's all this kind of articles about perceptions, attitudes, curriculum development, and readiness, and things like that, the potential of AI. But perhaps in your classrooms, you've already started to see the change that we see in the literature, which is this idea of primary intervention studies, things that we're actually starting to see LLMs used quite directly in the classroom, not just for learning, but also things like visual labeling of ultrasound images for point of care, and a lot of conversation style agents. I imagine some of you are using them for patient encounters, simulations, and also for perhaps doing some coursework. So I imagine this is not an unfamiliar scenario to you. And so I suppose our study or our research approach is not so much the technology itself, but how we should best deliver AI-led learning for students. And sort of as a subset, I'm rather fascinated in how humans communicate with AI, this idea of human AI interaction and learning behavior. And the model I'm going to show you is something that we use here at the Chinese University, which is, we call it sort of generative AI within a narrow AI context. And so we actually have a narrow AI system, a sort of rudimentary AI that runs our classroom as an overseer. And the generative AI, in a sense, lives within that context. I'm going to show you all about that in just a little while. But first, a very brief tour down memory lane. One of the things that we always say is that we have been working on AI chatbots in anatomy teaching and the medical classrooms since 2020. And I don't know if some of you may recall, I'm quite old, maybe some of you will recall the small and medium-sized language models that came out from Google DeepMind's open source tools. And we like to use BERT, the bidirectional encoder, kind of quite an old and simple LLM system for our very first AI model back in 2020. And sort of our little claim to fame is that our first AI sort of in medical education publication was in the pre-ChatGPT era, so 2021, which was quite fun. And I think because we've been working in the classroom with chatbots for so long, we have a slightly different approach of seeing how it's used. What we find, oh, excuse me, slightly dying of the plague here, do excuse. Right. So one of the things we find is that the tools are very clever, but it doesn't necessarily make our students' learning any better at all. And in fact, what we find with our early models is that it just glues our students to the screen. So we just have this very screen-centric learning. And when you see the way our students interact with our earliest models, we found that it isolates the students quite a lot. They just have this to and fro with the dialogue system. And I don't think this is a really wonderful way to learn. So the current system kind of evolved from that to have two focuses. The first of which is on a kind of new human computer interface. So we really move away from clunky typing. And I can imagine if you're learning pharmacology, physiology, anatomy, and clinical medicine, people spend a lot of time typing or dictating to their chatbots. And I think we sort of moved away from that into touchscreens, QR codes. And the second thing is really to move away from text-based dialogue system to real human look and feel. And rather than taking something off the shelf, we sort of thought it'd be nice to include our faculty members, the sort of the personality, the voice, the interesting features. And we developed an in-house fully Gen AI cloned face and voice system for our teachers. So this handsome gentleman is from orthopedics, Samuel, one of my good friends, and he was our first victim of this sort of clone system. And I think what we wanted to do with this system is kind of to generate our narrow AI system, something that could supervise a classroom in a sort of relatively simple way. And I'll show you through that in a second. But what it allowed the teachers to do is really to have this script to video workflow. So the teachers really focus on educational design. What do you do in the classroom? When you come to the classroom, what kind of learning tasks you do as small groups? So let me introduce you to our digital faculty. I think the first thing to note about our system is that it's really very human size, it's very human scale. And I think the idea that we learned from our early studies is that having a kind of presence in the classroom does change the way people interact. If you say, I've got an app, put it on your phone or your iPad, it does make people sort of sit down on a bench and do it themselves. Whereas you have this sort of rather interesting teacher, people tend to cluster around it. They stand around and they talk to it as sort of one of the peers, if you like, or one of the teachers in quite a human way. And we found that having the size actually does change the learning behavior, which is kind of an interesting phenomenon. So they have a real classroom presence. And the narrow AI system that we first developed is very similar to a sort of flow diagram, or if you play video game RPG sort of dialogue systems, that kind of idea of a narrow AI system that focuses on group discussion. So the AI will supervise the students to do a kind of task-centric learning, a learning activity. And I guess the key point is that each group will be broken down into small groups of 3 or 4, and it can give individualized hints when the students are struggling with a particular learning task, and of course, instantaneous feedback whenever they're done. So this is kind of the big concept here. So what do I mean by narrow AI system? Well, if you imagine a class, this is kind of the workflow going through from task A to B, where people ask for a hint or an individual case, and it will give them a kind of learning journey, of which there are not, I think, that many permutations. And I'm going to come back to this, but I want to show you the concept in the next slide, and then we'll come back to here. Imagine a teacher. I don't know if any of you are medical educators. I would like to show you this painful problem that every medical teacher has when they do small group classes. You come to a class and you say, well, okay, did you all do the pre-class reading? Yes or no? And unfortunately, by some weird statistic, it's always exactly 50% have done the pre-class reading and 50% have not, which gives this teacher this impossible task. You can't satisfy both groups. It's not humanly possible to satisfy a group that's done the pre-class reading and a group that hasn't. So what do we do? Well, I think this kind of narrow AI system is perfect for that. So if they haven't done pre-class reading, it gives them the content core recap that they need before doing the task. And if they say yes, we'll say, well, I'm not sure I believe you 100%. Let's check your knowledge before you progress to the task. And in this way, it really, you get the sense of what we're trying to achieve with the narrow AI system. It is, you don't need infinite degrees of freedom to run a class at the very beginning. You need sort of relative guidance. And this is what the system is all about. It's taking students through a learning journey in a fairly narrow way, but then allowing them to undertake a task, get feedback, get evaluations, and so on. But for many of you, and I know you're quite an advanced group, you'll say, Dr. C, this is not generative enough, it's not AI enough. And I agree with you. And so this is where we come to the second stage, which is generative AI for learning. So we feel that the avatar system is a good placeholder, but it's a good vector, if you like, for delivering generative AI to support the learning. And let's just imagine you're doing an anatomy class, for example, you're doing a learning task, and you may have many questions that are not sort of pre-planned, if you like, within a narrow system. You certainly need generative AI for that, and we often deliver it in this sort of initially through a QR code. And we use our own in-house faculty developed system that we call the Polar. This is the Portable Offline Learning AI resource. And we're going to talk much more about this when we come to the renewable and sustainable side. But essentially, we give the students this flexibility to use a generative AI to help them alongside their narrow AI learning. So we sort of have these two together and hopefully get this context of generative AI, but in a narrow AI context. It is not the focus of the class to come in and start using an LLM straight away. And I think we found that really valuable. The students are very engaged with the task, but they always know the LLM is there for them. So I will talk much more about this later on, but just to give you an idea of how we develop the Polar model, we take a base model, open source based model, kind of a small model actually, and we reduce the size significantly with quantization, RAG, and some specific fine tuning techniques. And we've sort of tested it through, but I won't dwell on this because we'll come back to this later. And this is kind of how we deliver it. And we'll talk about the offline system in a while. So this gives us the model, our sort of teaching model, if you like, of the AI classroom, where the students have overall guidance and a framework. They come into the classroom and they're given the broad strokes of what a class looks like from the narrow AI system, and they're given the support from the generative AI. And of course, there's one thing I think that's always missing, which is the teacher side. So the things that even the LLM cannot perhaps do, things like role modeling, things like clinical experience, things like jokes, although we've found the LLM is much funnier than me. That's not true of every teacher, you'll appreciate. And so we have this model, which is called the GNT model. It's not the drink, it's GNT as in generative AI with a narrow AI context and a teacher together. And we find that this kind of combination handles all of the degrees of freedom that you might need within a typical tutorial class. And I think the teacher's role, and I say this partly because I want to stay employed, is still important for the things that are even out of the reach of the generative AI, things like helping the students who are most struggling despite all of the tools, and to also assist the students who are the most brilliant. I think these are the ones that they finish all the class materials and they want something more. So the teacher deals with two ends of the spectrum, the extremes, and most of the students can manage themselves very well within the central context. So that's quite theoretical. I'm now going to take you into our classrooms here at the Chinese University to show you the before and after. This is sort of the glow up or classroom glow up or fitness journey, but for classroom. So this is our current challenge in teaching. So 1 or 2 years ago, this is what our class looks like. On the left side, you have obstetrics and gynecology clinical skills teaching. You have an overworked and underpaid teacher with a horde of students trying to see a bimanual examination of the vagina. Now, you can imagine they probably can't even see what's going on for most of them who are standing behind her. So it's quite a difficult context. And I'm going to show you another class. So on the right-hand side is my bioethics class. We have a small group discussion, but you can see for a small group discussion, that is quite a horde of people. It's about 30, I have about 32 people in my so-called small group classes of 1 hour, which gives me about 2 minutes per person, really, if you think about it. So this was sort of our particular problem setting. And also that we teach in English, but many of our students prefer to discuss, particularly bioethics and conversational class in Cantonese. So this is another layer of complexity that we have here in Hong Kong. So that's the old classroom. I'd like to take you on a tour of our new classroom setup. And this is, let me see if this will play. I've got quite a big ego, by the way, so you'll just see lots of my face, as my wife likes to say, a bit too much of my face. So this is what the classroom looks like in the GNT setup. So hopefully you can see we have these human-sized panels, and they're not just standalone. You can see there's a working desk, worksheets, there's resources for learning. So they have skulls, brain models, and so on. And I think it makes it kind of an interesting setup is a bit like having a teacher or teaching assistant with real teacher-like setups, active learning stations, and the students gather around and they sort of talk with and at the AI system. And the model really allows for increasing degrees of freedom in the questions that they have to ask. So that's a little bit about what it looks like. And I'd like to take you through a real AI enhanced classroom, which we do in this kind of three-stage design. So we kind of, I don't know which level, perhaps some of you are clinical, some of you are preclinical, but I'll take you through an anatomy classroom. So we did this small bones of the wrist, the carpal bones class in a three-stage design where we do the basic anatomy, applied medical knowledge, and then clinical case evaluations. So the first part, which I think is really suited for the Avatar system, is a recap, review, and learning task of basic anatomy. So I think our students are pretty good with the memory and the bookwork, but it's a great chance for them to have a theoretical lesson on the bones, the names, the positions, and getting them to draw a theoretical diagram and have it assessed. And I think this is kind of a simple stage, something you can all quite understand. The second stage moves very quickly on to applied medical knowledge. And I think this is quite an interesting one where the task supervision of the avatar says, okay, well, we'd like to show you, you to show me the carpal bones on your own hand. So can you paint them in different colors and do a labeling system? And what we find is that people are very good at theoretical knowledge. And when we ask them to point on to where it is on the human, this is what we get. So on the left side is what some of our students said. On the right side, I'm sure some of you more experienced people would say, well, that's actually where the carpal bones are. It's quite shocking. You know, the students will know the information very, very well. And yet when you apply it to a patient or themselves, it's quite vastly different. So this is quite a magical moment of teaching that the AI can supervise. And you can imagine if one teacher had to deal with 35 or 40 people, it's quite difficult to match the pace. But they're in these small groups of 3 or 4, going through at their own pace. So I think this has been really helpful. The third part, which I think is really the strength, is the clinical cases. So we go from the learning of the basics to applying it to clinical cases. And you can see here there's an X-radiograph and a handsome other doctor. And I say that because it's very important. I think if you have a class taught by a single teacher, that teacher is in some ways the limiting point. You might have an anatomist or a clinician, but they can't both embody the same human. But of course, in the Avatar system, they really can embody the same device. And therefore, you can have multiple teachers adding to different phases of the learning, which I think is really helpful. So Samuel here is reviewing some of his real cases from his fracture clinic and asking the students to go through and identify where the fractures are and to label the bones and the mechanism of injury. Something that I wouldn't necessarily do. I'm not an orthopedic surgeon. And so I think this is a really interesting way to construct a class altogether. You have multiple entities, multiple personalities within a single class. And that is perhaps the strength of the system over a human teacher. And so this is how our sort of students run the classroom. We do some experimentation work to see whether or not it works. So our first study was of about 100 students, and we found that the knowledge, but more importantly and more pleasingly, their application and interpretation on a self-efficacy scale was quite increased. And I think also their knowledge gain was pretty good. So they went from sort of a borderline pass 55 to the edge of our distinction boundary, which is around 70%, so 69 and something. So they were certainly learning, I think, from this kind of class. And the overview of what we're trying to do here is to have this hierarchy of interaction. So actually the narrow AI does quite a lot of the work. But of course, our students do love to ask technical questions and further explore with the generative AI. And because it's in-house, the issues around hallucinations and confabulation, which is actually what we should say. We shouldn't, as medical people, say hallucination because it's not sensory. But anyway, they have less issues with that. And then, of course, the teachers there as well. I'm going to take you through one last bit of data before we go on to the second phase, which is the sustainability part. This seems like very technical education, so clinical skills for obstetrics or maybe anatomy learning. But you may be surprised to find we have AI in different tutorial settings too, like being a facilitator for bioethics discussion. So in this class, the AI acts as a bilingual sort of discussion facilitator in the way that we used to do as teachers. And we set up a class that was the sort of, ironically, the AI teaching the students about the ethical use of AI in healthcare, so some sort of AI squared system, clinical dilemmas in AI. And we got the students to do some of these guided tasks, such as risk categorization, and discuss what they really think is a high risk and high skill task for an AI to do. And again, we do like to look at the experimental data. I know this is not always the most exciting thing, but it's quite important that we don't just have these mad ideas and then it doesn't really work. So in this case, we took a public health kind of approach, this idea of a non-inferiority study to say, well, at least is our AI at least as good as a human teacher? And here we had, again, sample size of 122 to two groups, and we used a standardized multiple choice bioethics test, as well as some learner satisfaction scales and so on. And we were quite tight. So we said we're going to set a margin of 5% difference between to say whether or not it's non-inferior to human. So that's it's relatively not generous to ourselves. And as it turns out, the AI instruction was found to be non-inferior. And in fact, if you look at the graph carefully, the projected mean was slightly higher in the AI classroom. But of course, the most important thing is the standard deviation is with both within the confidence interval is both overlapping. So it does mean it's statistically the AI was non-inferior to our human class. And I think it was quite interesting. I think a lot of students felt it was quite good, but some of them had human-led preferences for things that we'll sort of talk about later on. I think it's interesting to see how the students feel about being taught by an AI facilitator for at least part of the class, because my interest is really human AI interaction. So I thought capability-wise, they were very positive on the AI. They said, it wasn't rushed, it wasn't confusing, quite consistent in explaining concepts, which maybe humans are not so good at, actually. And I think bilingual support was very useful. I must confess, you can probably tell I'm quite British. I chased my wife over to Hong Kong, and I don't really speak very good Chinese at all. I can order something unhealthy at a cafe, that's about it. And so I think the students being able to choose the language of moderation was really very helpful for them. And there are many contexts where I think this would be good. And I think the rationale and the reasoning was quite good as well. Now, one thing which I found even more fascinating is this idea of the perceived benefits of AI, and in particular, the first one, this idea that I felt less intimidated being asked questions in an AI-led session. Now, I can tell you, I don't know how your classes run in your universities, but if we have this class of 40 people, I take a microphone and I put someone on the spot and ask someone, so we're talking about this bioethical issue, what principles are at play, or what do you think? And I think that's quite an intimidating thing. I seem very friendly to you over the screen. I could be quite a mean teacher. I think I could be quite strict. But there's none of that with the AI. And I think the students were very free to make mistakes in front of the AI, which I think is a wonderful thing, really. And it doesn't judge or show favoritism. I feel sort of personally attacked by that comment. But yes, sure, probably, we all have our biases. So I think it's very interesting. The non-human elements of an AI teacher was in some ways an advantage. Kind of fascinating, I thought. And of course, they miss the warmth and personal connection and empathy and being able to do follow-up sessions with the teacher. And I think the AI, of course, struggles with the very unexpected or nuanced questions in the same way that a human would. But so hopefully you get the sense of what we're doing is really facilitating peer discussion learning using AI systems in very small groups. I think the big advantage here is that it's very self-paced. No one's rushing you to do it. You go at the pace of your very small group. And I love to see our students happily making mistakes. I think in Asia, particularly in Hong Kong, there's a bit of a stigma of being seen to fail, to be honest with you. People don't like to be seen to get questions wrong. But when the teacher's not there, this freedom to just go, I'm not really sure, let's try. Now let's explain why it wasn't correct is really a very good thing. And I'm sort of quite pleased that that's been a positive interaction. And just to let you know a few things that this is now across various two teaching sites, and we have lots of different subjects being taught with the system. And there's some other pictures of things that I think is not that relevant. It's nice to show off a little bit. So we have won a bunch of awards and random things. And I have a really big and wonderful team who are lovely. So I need to say a very big thank you to Yasin, Nikki, Bilvik, Johnny, Charlotte, Jasmine, Bernice, Charlie, Shireen, and Suki, who's not on there as well. And so that's the big context. It's taken me a big wind up to get to the bit where I think the bit perhaps that you'll care a bit more about, which is the evolution of our program to a green and sustainable AI classroom. So I'll just take a breath here to say, I think we've been very proud of what we've achieved in the classroom, but I'm quite an irresponsible person. I wonder if you're as irresponsible as me. I use AIs for everything. I mean, how am I going to explain the concept of time to my kids? You know, how to text my wife without annoying her for certain things. I mean, I use AI from when I wake up until I go to sleep. And I think it's something that we all do. And I wasn't aware of how much of a problem this was until I moved on to this idea of sustainability and consumption and production of the UN SDGs. And there were two slides that I was shown at another presentation that sort of blew my mind. The first one is this idea of total AI consumption. This idea that in about 3 years' time, maybe two and a bit years' time, about over 10% of US electricity expenditures expected to grow to be used on AI. And I think in Southeast Asia, I have friends over in Malaysia and Singapore who just report these gigantic data processing centers being built near these residential areas. And it's sort of quite frightening, I think, the amount of resources going into it. But I think perhaps the one that was more worrying for me was this. I remember this sort of estimated carbon emission per query. And I remember the old Google search and then GPT-4. And then as we go up the ladder to GPT-5, 4.5, and now 5 with the intense processing version, not the rapid version, it's even larger. And just I remember seeing this slide and thinking, wow, maybe I am really irresponsible. Is there something we can do about this from a teaching perspective? And so I think what we wanted to do to reduce the carbon footprint was to say, we want to support our teachers, our students with LLMs, but we want to do it in a way that's environmentally responsible and also to raise awareness. I mean, I think when I saw this, it quite changed my mind on how I should be using things. So I think raising awareness was a big secondary goal, and really to provide the educational support that we've been doing, but in a more responsible way. And so what we did was we had this history, of course, of using really small and kind of fairly bad language models in the past. So we wanted to go as small as we could with the large language models and the base models. And so we kind of looked at four perspectives: model selection, looking at fine tuning, but from a parameter efficient perspective, seeing how much we could quantize the data, which is quite a fun process, to be honest, and then RAG, which everyone is kind of doing. And I think that the thing that we wanted to do was this idea of local processing through the blessing of Apple Silicon and local processing. And I should declare, I'm actually sponsored by Apple. This is kind of like a really wild thing. If you go to my Instagram, I get free stuff from Apple. I get like the Ultra Watch 3 and I do health content for them. But this is not a talk that's sponsored by Apple. One of the things I say about the blessing of Apple Silicon is that it really allowed us to do more with local processing in a way that other systems haven't really allowed us to do with old generation smartphones. And I think this has been quite a transformation. If you ever have one of those old Mac minis, the first generation Apple Silicon, you can do amazing local processing on one of those. You could buy them on eBay for like less than 100 US dollars. So it's kind of amazing. But anyway, I'll talk about the technical side later on. But these four approaches, we really wanted to say, can we make our locally processed LLM as efficient as possible compared to sending everything off to the cloud? So the first thing we did was to look at the base model. And we know that obviously the biggest models have maybe trillions of parameters. And we know that choosing small models can save quite a lot of energy while performing quite well, particularly if we define the scope. And of course, we're doing medical education. So our scope is quite clear. It is often very well defined. So restricting the domains was going to be a key here. And again, when we looked at the general performance of LLM, so F1 score being the functional performance answer quality to questions, and on the bottom we have a log scale of parameters. You can see that if we jump up to GPT-4 or the big or DeepSeek, it's really very big, very, very large size here. This is logarithmic. But if we come down to this area here, you're losing a bit of performance, from maybe 7.6 to like 6.8. So it's not a huge drop, but your size is significantly, significantly reduced, and therefore the compute required is going to be significantly reduced. So we sort of started looking at the smaller llamas in particular, and to say, well, can we take this as our base model? So that was very interesting. And the second approach we took was looking at how we can do fine tuning, because fine tuning, as many of you will know, is very time consuming and is also quite power consuming as well. But I think if we look at parameter efficient fine tuning, looking at some specific parameters, and we were using LoRa. It's quite an old technique from 2021, something we're a bit familiar with, sort of reparameterizing sort of a limited amount. We changed our model, our 8 billion parameter Llama 3.1 base model, quite significantly, actually. So I'd like to show you this here. So in the old base model, we would say, for example, can you explain the boundaries of the cubital fossa in the I guess the upper arm, and it would give us this thing. And then after we wanted to give it a style that's more for the classroom, so we did our LoRa fine tuning. You can see actually it's quite a different. The content is much the same, but the explanation is far more student-friendly, student-facing, and importantly, it does things like, for example, to do this quiz approach. So it doesn't just say, here's a bunch of information, there you go, but rather it gets into the dialogue teacher study buddy system, where it says, I'm going to quiz you on other things, I'm going to give you this question-answer approach. And so I thought, this kind of performance was what we were looking for, and what you might look for from a big high performance model, but in a pretty small size. So we managed to get down with an 8 billion parameter model. I think the thing that we've enjoyed most, really, I'm sort of smiling because our AI engineer who's not on this call, but he enjoys this, is looking at how can we reduce the parameters, the bit size, and still retain quite a good amount of precision. And I think it's been quite fun, really, to enjoy reducing the weighting for each of the parameters. And I think we got down to 8-bit, which really reduced the size significantly. And by quantizing the model approach, reducing the power, bandwidth, storage, of course, which is an on-app storage. So that's kind of important, I guess, for our Recycle smartphone approach. And even the performance is not bad at all. So I think quantization was a really interesting way, and it's not being done that much, at least so far in medical education space. And then you can see that actually the performance here, if you see the full model here, the full parameters, and the size of a 2.4 gigabyte size. So we got a compression down from a normal full-size model at 2.5 gigabytes roughly to half a gigabyte in size. And you can see the performance that we're getting down in this area is not bad at all, actually. It's pretty good in terms of like the question performance within a specific domain, particularly for anatomy, obstetrics, and so on. It's pretty good. So we were quite happy with the overall performance in terms of compression. Finally, I think something that needs no introduction to an audience like yourselves, but I think using RAG for context was very helpful for us because we are having the concept of army of bots. I think we've always had this idea that we don't want an Ultron-style overlord bot. We want a sort of army of small and capable chatbots that are deployed for specific use cases. And therefore, when we use RAG for our individual bots, this has been rather helpful. And of course, this is going to constrain the data, and particularly for things like anatomy, where the database is not very live. I don't know if you know, but the human body has not undergone dramatic changes over the last 100 years or so. And so we are quite happy with that. And even with clinical specialties, we can push from a central and vetted perspective updates to the model periodically, but it's not something that you desperately need the most cutting edge material for. For example, when it comes to the examination of a patient, that procedure hasn't changed too much. Speculum examination, for example, has not changed too much. So I think this is kind of an important feature. So let me just, click this through. So let me now take you on a tour of our Green AI classroom. And this concept, the thing that you can see here, we call it the garden. And so the idea is that we take our lightweight language model directly onto recycled smartphones up to 4 generations old so far, and we put the Polar system on, and we then disconnect it from the internet. So I think there's a few interesting advantages. First of all, when a student comes into our classroom, we say you're not allowed to use AI on your phone or your laptop. But if you want some Gen AI support, can you go over to the garden and take one of these recycled smartphones to use as your kind of AI assistant for the day, which is kind of interesting. And I think what we're trying to do here is to minimize like actual costs, so monetary. We're quite cheap. University people, we're always trying to cut corners, and so we save a lot of money. Number one, on token fees, which is quite expensive. Number two, we are really taking e-waste and saying, well, we give it a really nice use case, and I'm quite proud of that. I think it's great. We're not selling it back to Apple. We're not throwing it away, but it has a real life in the classroom, and I think that's really great. I think the third thing is we're really giving students this sense of like, do you know how much carbon you're using when you ask ChatGPT, where's the best bagel in downtown Sydney? It's kind of a serious thing. And so this is the third aspect that we're doing. So I think this has been something we have had some success with. Again, I'm going to show you some nice, boring educational study data. So here you can see we tested ChatGPT versus our polar model for obstetrics and gynecology for a small group test. And this was ChatGPT 4.5, I should say. And again, looking at the performance, you can see that our polar group, in terms of the actual outcome performance, had around 3% difference. And here we had an error range of 10% for the performance. So, of course, it performs slightly worse than a full blown ChatGPT learning support tool in terms of the students doing an MCQ supported by one LLM or the other. But the performance range is not bad, actually. It's still well within a 10% error range, considering the performance. And I think when we look at the secondary outcomes, number one, according to our calculation, we're using around 88% less energy on the polar model compared to GPT, particularly GPT-5. And that's not factoring in actually our e-waste device reuse. I was really happy to get some of the feedback from the students. And I think, for some students, they just said, this is the first time we've heard someone say sustainable and AI together. It's not something people say that often. And they're really happy to be part of that movement. And, I think they like the fact that it's almost as good as ChatGPT, and they know that it's not quite the same, but it's not bad. And I think also they like the RAG links that give it to the source document and sort of give them not a black book answer, which has been quite helpful. I think the truth of the matter is we have this concept partly born from seeing the sad scenes around the world in Ukraine and Gaza and other conflict regions. I think many of you as sort of humanitarian and very sort of clinical people worry about the health and the well-being and all of these things. But I am just a pure educator by now. So my perspective is always a little bit like, how is it like to teach? Can you imagine teaching in a medical school where the internet keeps cutting off, or you don't want to send your data to the US or China? But we want our students to have LLM support. I can't imagine, actually. I think it must be really terrible. And so I think having tools like these is something that I would really like to support fellow educators who are in really complex settings and complex regions. And so we're really delighted to go to Pakistan and Armenia, countries that sort of sit in between East and West and may not necessarily wish to send their information to overseas companies in one of the big superpowers. And maybe the infrastructure is not so good either. So I think this is another kind of important dimension to what we're doing. It's obviously less important than the aid, the physical aid, the health aid that other people need. But we all do our own thing, and I'm afraid this is just my small way. This is my own way of trying to help, I guess. So I think what we try to do is to change the carbon cost itself, to do some local processing and maybe changing the attitudes as well, which I think has been quite nice. I've talked at you for a long time, so I can see you. Thank you, first of all, for paying attention. I just want to say a last few concluding talks. I think what we've tried to do is to take an AI-led classroom, and at least to show maybe we can get comparable to human-led teaching approaches to support medical education. And I can see there's some strong advantages. There's always a role for a teacher in the classroom as well. I think having this idea of teachers and narrow AI and generative AI all together does deal with a classroom, which I think medical education classrooms are quite complex. And I think it's difficult to say this tool is the best tool. I don't think any of them are really, but I think they're quite complementary. And I do like that element. And I hope we'll do more and more with these things, both in our home of Hong Kong and also abroad. and maybe we'll visit you all one day. You've got quite a snazzy classroom over there, so perhaps I'll get the chance to visit one day and just talk about things and see how you learn, because I am, after all, most interested in how humans and AI interact for the betterment of mankind. And with that, I'd like to say, thank you so much for your attention, really. Thank you. I can see the clapping. I can't hear it. So, but thank you for that. I saw there's three people in the front who are
Oh
so
yeah,
that's very
no,
kind of you.
we've got
Awesome.
plenty
Thank you.
clapping for you, Chris.
Okay,
Thank you so much for your
that's
talk.
very kind. Thank you. Let me
Um,
just
I think
find it.
we'll go over for a couple of questions. I had a question
Sure.
to start us off. So I know that I myself included use AI a lot for, I guess, personalized learning when it comes to figuring out what I'm weak at and asking like
Mhm.
specific questions. In this sort of initiative, like is that sort of a future direction where the individual like student in the classroom, like you can
Mhm.
recognize their sort of like extra homework if necessary, where they can take the
Mhm.
history that they gain from the AI interaction, like back home, sort of thing, or beyond the classroom?
Ah, that's very interesting. So you mean sort of the chat log or the chat history, in a sense, reflects what the students know and don't know. That's very interesting. So I think from the narrow AI system, first of all, we do take a log of the performance, including time on task and number of errors. Now, this actually gives us two very interesting insights. Number one, it shows us where we're bad at teaching. So there will be things that students do in the classroom where everyone in the class performs quite poorly. And that is not you, that's us. If you think about it, that it must be that we're teaching that particular aspect quite poorly. And so it's a great kind of feedback system for the teachers in that respect. I think for our students, we do give them access remotely to our in-house LLM so they can continue the learning outside of the classroom and they can continue the dialogue. I think the thing that's reassuring for them is that we derive our assessments primarily from the database that's in the LLMs. So they know that plus or minus the material they're learning from is fairly close to what they'll be examined on. And that's a kind of confidence that when you ask a random off-the-shelf chatbot, not everyone is 100% confidence that even if the answer is great, is it how my teacher's going to examine me? These are two quite different dimensions. And so that confidence, I think, is quite important. So I think it's great for the students to have that kind of learning access at home and to have that dialogue. But it's most important that we tell them what's the expectation from the exams and that it's quite close to the AI outputs, I think.
I see. Yeah, I think that's a great point you made about it's sort of keeping the loop closed and holding, I guess, the classroom's role in teaching the specific learning objective and doing it really well. I have a couple more questions to follow up, but if anyone else, does anyone else have any questions in the room? The question that I had was, so this is medical student education. I for one, like have worked on projects for instance, like patient education, like in inpatient
Mhm.
stays, and I think that's a really important place where our current system doesn't like just is resource limited and may not pay
Mhm.
as much attention to. Uh,
Mhm.
any sort of reflections on how the system can generalize beyond medical students to other, I guess, even junior doctors or
Mhm.
other healthcare staff or even patients?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting question and an interesting problem for Hong Kong, which has quite a high pressure medical system. I think a lot of my clinical colleagues say, well, you can never replace a doctor-patient interaction with a chatbot. It's just not the same kind of empathy and interaction. And I always have this concept of BPBD, best person, best day. I think the best doctor on the best day can never be beaten in terms of the way they interact with the patient. However, when doctors have 50 outpatient appointments to see that morning and they need to explain, for example, the follow-up care of a cataract or what exactly they mean by this operation, what are the risk factors in detail, um, I think we don't have the time for that, to be honest. A lot of doctors simply don't have that time. A chatbot, whether it's humanized in an avatar system or even in a text system, has infinite patience, can be asked repeatedly without getting vexed, and I think has that kind of wonderful patience that and non-judgmentalness, which is really, really important. And when I think of things like surgical consent, I would much rather a patient explore it fully with the chatbot for several reasons. I mean, to be just sorry, I'm just gonna wipe my nose a little bit. So for one legal reason, for example, your chatbot dialogue will have all of the trace of what you've talked about with the bot. So a patient can't turn around and say, "Oh, he didn't explain the concept, the risk factor for this laparoscopic procedure correctly," because it's going to be obvious, right? It's going to be part of the dialogue, which is that makes things a bit more robust. But I do think giving patients the time to digest an explanation is so important, especially when the management is not just medical or surgical, but when it has any kind of lifestyle modification, any complex understanding of what their treatment involves. We never have enough time to give it to them, but we should. And I think this is where chatbots are really wonderful. And I think I compare this to I used to have a personal trainer who I liked very much. But within that session, it would always be like they'd always tell me like, "Oh, you got to do this, 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 and this, and this," and I never remember anything. And now my personal trainer's name is Mr. DeepSeek. And I must say, it's been great because I can just check in with this trainer all the time. It's very clear. They never judge, they never, it's always very slow. And I can take a lot of time to understand what they're really saying. And I suppose this would reflect to patients too. And I hope our patients would benefit from that. But I don't want to cut doctors out of the loop entirely. I think there are very selective things we can choose to deburden the doctors and benefit the patients. And it's definitely a win-win. This is what I foresee anyway.
Beautiful. That makes a lot of sense to me. Thanks for that. We got a question from the group.
Hi, first of all, thank you for your speech. The question I had is like you've done a lot of research into like human AI interactions and human behavior. Do you see like you're talking about young people and how we're able to interact with it, we're able to like easily like pick up how to use an LLM. But in the hospital, especially like in an aging society, a lot of the interaction will be across a wide range of demographics. How do you see that human interaction, that human AI in that scenario?
I do agree that this is kind of a problem. See, you're all the digital natives. I used Dead Tree and Pen for my exams and for my learning. I had to go to the library and fight with people for like 3 copies of a book when I was studying. And I fought pretty well to do that. So I think you're right to say the older generation, they're not as fluent. I think the closer we get to human simulating interaction, perhaps the easier it might be. And I think the difference between what we use in our classroom is we try to be quite humanoid and not just in the appearance, although that's quite important, but the way that the chatbot chats. For example, my avatar is very British and very sarcastic. It's quite similar to me in many ways, whereas I think my other colleagues are quite, they have a lot of Cantonese pun jokes. In our language, there's a lot of puns people could. And so I think the idea of having a as natural as possible dialogue-based system that doesn't depend on typing is very important. And I think this is, you think about issues of elderly healthcare, sight, particularly near sight. You talk about the physical dexterity and sort of accuracy of fine manipulation. These are kind of issues that people might have. And if it's sort of a dialogue system, even for hard of hearing patients, there's much more we can do in terms of like bone conduction assistance, hearing aid assisted AI dialogue systems. I would like to move it more towards a really quite a human-like system with the LLM just sitting on the back end. And we know that's what's doing it. I mean, we all understand that the LLM is sitting at the back end. What they're facing is really just the manifestation of that. But I think the patient experience is really important. And you're right to say we need to understand what is the more elderly experience with an LLM. So that's the long answer. The short answer is we need to do some experimenting with the target population to give them a prototype tool and to watch how they use it. And my favorite way to do that, I sound like a bit of a creepy person, but I put like a little webcam sometimes on the front of the device. And I even sometimes ask people to wear like wearable devices like a chest mounted GoPro, head mounted something to see where they're looking and how they're talking, to map out actually how they behave. And I think maybe this is something I'd like to do as well with our elderly patients. How are they really using it? Not just what we guess would be good for them. So thank you for raising it. I think it's a really great point, actually. So thank you.
Any comments from our geriatrician colleagues?
Hi, Chris. Thank you so much for that talk. That was great. I'm a geriatrician here in Victoria. It's not related to aging, actually, but I just thought this is such a great idea because I think when we think about medical education now in this era of AI, I think there's two main things that we sort of worry about. One is, like you said, is it accurate the information that students are getting from, the chat GPTs and the DeepSeeks? And so having this sort of locally hosted model is a brilliant idea because you get to have that control over what sort of information you're crafting and presenting to students. But the other thing I was really thinking about that this could make a huge difference is you have medical students from all walks of life and all backgrounds. And so like I've met a lot of students who, come from relatively well-off families, so they can afford the expensive subscriptions to Claude and ChatGPT and, all the sort of private subscription-based stuff. But I think we do sort of forget about the other cohort sometimes, who might be struggling from poor backgrounds or, just trying to sort of make money just to pay off their school fees,
Yeah.
like in America. So I just think this is such a great idea. And do you have any plans to, I guess, scale this firstly to the rest of the hospitals and universities in Hong Kong? And secondly, to other countries, maybe like UK, where you're from, or Australia?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, thank you for your comment. And I think it's something that you're absolutely right. I think it's both from the intra and the inter school perspective. I think from the intra school perspective, you're right. When you look at a cohort of students, we don't want the AI to be a divisive factor about who performs well or better or whose study journey is different. I think it's quite tragic, actually, if that's the case. So I really support your notion on that. And even from the inter perspective, part of the reason we want to go to slightly less well-resourced countries is that there's this global divide where people paying for token access to OpenAI compared to people who maybe can't quite afford that kind of service. In terms of expansion, I mean, I think to be very cynical, we're quite lucky that the project's got quite a bit of traction here. And particularly with our approach, we've just put in a couple of grant applications for taking what we do in the classroom here abroad, particularly to low resource settings, like I say, Pakistan, Armenia, and maybe sort of Southeast Asia more locally. But I think it's interesting to hear that from Australia. I think of you guys as quite a well-resourced place, but I'm glad to hear that you feel it can be valuable in your classroom as well. So I think I love to work with people. I'm sort of despite loving AI, I'm kind of quite a people person. So I think it'd be great to see what we can develop in collaboration with overseas colleagues, and certainly going to visit. I'm hoping to visit Australia in August next summer for I think there's like an International Anatomy Association meeting that I'm going to do something for. So perhaps that could be a time just to bring over some of our devices and see how you like it. So I'm very easy to find. So please feel free to get in touch, and I would love to see if we can put something together for your classroom, because I hope we can transform more and more of what we're doing, in the positive things anyway, to other classrooms. So thank you for your comment.
Thanks, Chris. There's also a comment in the chat, which I think links quite nicely. So Santiago Ortega from Mexico asked, what tool or AI do you think would be most viable to implement in classrooms in countries with poor technology infrastructure? And also, what sorts of ways would generate interest among these universities to invest in them?
Ooh, interesting. For the technology side, I'm very cautious to make every problem a nail with, and that AI is the hammer for. I think sometimes it's very easy to just say, oh, LLMs will solve everything. I think it kind of really depends on the context of your teaching. And this is why I kind of combine simple narrow AI tools with generatives, because sometimes the advantages of one can be more than the other in your specific setting. And so it's difficult for me to say exactly, but I tend to think things that need less physical infrastructure would be our first consideration or target. So I think, Santiago, I should say. So I think something like a locally processed LLM gives you this sort of infinite access, if you like, to the data that's a little bit under control, and it can even be processed on your phone. So the cost, really the absolute monetary cost is quite low. And so I think that could be quite interesting. I think to pitch things to universities takes two types of information, cost information and efficacy information. You've probably seen that, even though I think my ideas are quite interesting, or I personally like them, I'm always quite careful to do associated studies that show the benefit, the outcome, non-inferiority, because I think this is the pitching language to the powers that be, to say, we're doing this cool and interesting thing. Oh, and by the way, it really works. I think that aspect is so important. So when it comes to persuading universities to come on board with it, to say, here's a study people have done on a large scale and it really improves the classroom, and also it cuts cost and reliance on external providers and all these other issues that we've seen if you use off-the-shelf models. Perhaps you've even seen this idea of model shift. So people were using ChatGPT 4.5, and then when the early editions of 5 came out, the answer differences were so vast from 4 that it became quite difficult to deal with. So I think there's a lot of these issues that you can take to the universities, but I think those policymakers often look at efficacy and return on investment. So number one, what are we saving? Number two, does it really work? I think these two parameters would be building your case, I think.